Welcome to the Painting of the Week podcast, where we look at some of the most significant paintings throughout history. Introducing your hosts, Phil Grabsky and Laura Bentham.
Welcome to this week's Painting of the Week, and we have a treat for you today. I'm going to be talking with Richard Hill from the Vancouver Art Gallery about Deep Forest by Emily Carr, painted in around 1931. As always, if you go to the 7th-art.com website and click on the podcast button, the painting will come up for you to look at while we're talking, or indeed on the YouTube site, same thing. I'm not with Laura today. She's back in the UK. I'm actually recording this while I'm on the west coast of the United States. Richard is in Vancouver. So we're doing this over Zoom, but I'm sure that will be absolutely fine. Now, Richard, thank you very much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I went to the Vancouver Art Gallery. I always go to the Vancouver Art Gallery when I'm in Vancouver, which is maybe once a year. And basically put it out to you to choose your favorite painting or a painting that you wanted to talk about. I'm very glad for a couple of reasons that you chose a work by Emily Carr, but I'll come on to that. But let me start by asking, what drew you to choose Deep Forest?
I think Emily Carr is an overlooked, well, let's put it this way. In Canada, she's an iconic figure. Outside Canada, I think she's one of the great overlooked modernist painters.
Yeah.
And I just feel very excited to try to introduce people to this amazing artist. And for me, I think she was the first artist that I saw growing up in Vancouver as someone who didn't have a lot of access to art as a young person, frankly, who represented the landscape that I had grown up in and that I recognized in some way. And, she's been, in a way, the kind of matriarch of Vancouver, BC art. Really someone who no one has painted a pine tree in BC or photographed one or done any of that kind of worked with that subject matter without in some way showing the influence or being understood as working out of a tradition that she created. So I think she's very important in that way, and I'm excited to talk about it. And I'm also working on a couple of exhibitions related to her work, and so I'm in the middle of revisiting them and thinking about these works that they were very influential on me when I was in my late teens and early 20s. I read, she wrote a lot about her work as well and about her life, and so I had read all those texts a long time ago, and to kind of come back to them now all these years later and to have a chance to work with the amazing collection of Emily Carr paintings that we have here at the gallery has just been really exciting.
Great. Well, there's a number of different ways I could go with other questions, but one thing that comes to mind straight away, I've just been at a film festival and not far from here, a place called Friday Harbour. And a good number of the films were reflective of, in some way, on man's relationship with nature. Some of them are very sad. Some of the films are about the decline of the orcas because of things, the ways in which man has intervened and maybe preventing the salmon from going up rivers or taking the orca off to aquariums around the world or whatever it might be. One of the things that strikes me about Emily Carr is that, as far as I understand it, she was somebody who saw the natural world not as a resource to be plundered, but something to be admired and revered. and we're talking over 100 years ago. Is that the case? Is she one of the first to, at least from a non-Indigenous people's point of view, use her art to reflect the natural world in a way that was significantly different to what was happening around her?
I think she was part of a movement. I mean, in a way, she's an inheritor of the traditions of Romanticism and that kind of engagement with the natural world that came out of that movement, and was so influential on even the rise of the landscape as an important subject. And I think with Carr, it was really a question of trying to absolutely have this deep spiritual engagement with the landscape she was in, and to distinguish it really from the European landscape tradition. And it's interesting, she did that through engagement with the European tradition of modernist painting on one hand, but at the same time, she developed in a way a kind of visual language that was very suited to the rainforests of the Pacific Northwest, and came to be a very local, in particular, and distinctive image of our forests here. And she was also someone who actually looked at and pictured in her paintings that kind of tension that's absolutely defined the Canadian view of the landscape, and certainly in British Columbia, which is between the value of resource extraction and the way that drives the economy, and at the same time the desire for aesthetic appreciation. People come here from all over the world to to ski, to visit our forests and mountains, and I think people, if you've been here and had a chance to walk through some of the rainforests, I'm sure when you went into the gallery or when you look at reproductions of these images, you'll really see that she saw something and was able to capture it in a really distinct way. And there's that love and that desire to have that moment of communion, absolutely, for sure.
Can we just step back a little bit? Can you describe the painting to us? What are we actually looking at? What should we particularly notice?
Well, one of the things that has really drawn my interest recently when I've been looking at these, and I'm going to be doing a installation from our permanent collection that will open in January, that is really about this question of, it kind of builds on what you were just talking about, this desire for communion with nature. And I want to look at it in terms of the way Emily Carr uses space. And one of the things that has struck me when I was going back and reading a lot of her writing is there are a lot of moments when she talks about imaginatively entering the space of a painting or a landscape, or even another artist's landscape. Lauren Harris was another Canadian artist working around the same time in Ontario that she really admired, and when she saw his work, she rhapsodized about being able to kind of travel through the landscape. And one of the things that I noticed when I was looking at a lot of our cars is that the access to space is often foreclosed a little bit, or there's a kind of tension about how far you can actually enter into the landscape. And I thought that was interesting for someone who is, on one hand, really wanting to be at the heart of the forest and to capture this moment, and at the same time, you're in this kind of tension about how far are you on the edge of the forest, how impenetrable is that forest. And our forest here can be very impenetrable, so there's a kind of empirical dimension to it that, she's seeing something that's there. But I think also when you're dealing with the landscape tradition and that romantic tradition, that idea about, there's a kind of spatial metaphor about how far into that space you can get, therefore how close to nature you can be. We talk about our relationship to nature as a kind of proximity or closeness. We use that kind of metaphor. And I think a lot of her paintings kind of bring us right up in front of the natural world, and but at the same time suggests that there's something behind that maybe we're not quite getting to, or that that is a little bit held back from us. So I think in this painting you have a sense of that. You have some trees in the foreground, a couple of hills that are moving at different angles in relation to each other. One's kind of coming up to the right, the other two to the left, and it creates a bit of dynamism. And then you look past that into this almost glowing blue-gray area of forest, and there's something there. There's a kind of presence and energy. So I feel like that's one of the things that interests me about it. The other thing that I'm always very fascinated in her work is she really does use this very modern device of kind of stylizing towards these kind of massive, slightly geometrically idealized forms. So you have these big shapes. They're very solid, that you have a sense of mass, and at the same time, in tension with that is this kind of line that's always moving through the work, right? There's always this kind of undulation, and I think that's where you get the sense of that kind of animation that's going on in the work. And so she valued these kinds of forests. She also was somewhat rare, and also, especially towards the end of her life, she painted a lot of clear cuts. She was looking at deforestation, and she realized it was a subject. And so that's also very interesting. I'm going back to your earlier question a little bit, but because I realized I didn't close off that thought. But in this case, you really see her kind of immersed here. And one of the things that actually struck me as I was trying to organize the installation of the upcoming show is that this work is actually relatively rare in our collection of her landscapes of this type, in that it's actually in the so-called landscape format. Almost all her other paintings are actually in the portrait format. And you realize what that does is, of course, it brings you right up to the subject, right?
Yeah.
You don't have that landscape distance. And I started to think of them almost as tree portraits rather than as landscapes in the traditional sense. Although this one does open up the space a little bit more because it is in that horizontal landscape format.
It's very interesting. I mean, that's one of the early decisions that an artist makes, which is, the size of the canvas, portrait, landscape, square, circular. I mean, now she is, she's 59, 60 years old when she paints this. Could you tell me a little bit about her biography? I know that, for example, you're sitting in Vancouver, the painting's in Vancouver, but actually she's a Victoria-based artist, which, for those who don't know, that's the capital of Vancouver Island. Indeed, isn't Victoria the capital of British Columbia? Is that right?
That's right.
And Vancouver Island is actually it's a very large island. And I don't know whether being brought up in Victoria and on the island is somehow significant as opposed to Vancouver, but maybe just a little bit of her background. How does this, where does Emily come from?
Yeah, it's a fascinating biography. She's at that time Victorian. Right now Vancouver is a much larger city than Victoria, but at that time that wasn't necessarily so much the case. But she was in very much a very straight-laced middle class English family. Her father was a fairly successful merchant, and he set himself up in Victoria and did reasonably well. Emily was, I think, a favorite daughter. Basically, he really doted on her, but she had some very early tragedies. Both her parents died of tuberculosis within a couple of years of each other, and she had some kind of incident with her father regarding the discussion of sexuality in some way that she kind of mentioned in her notebooks, but no one's been exactly sure what that was. But it kind of put her off her father just before she died. So there's these kind of mysteries in her biography. I guess that's one of them. But she was a very independent-minded person, very, a little bit I think as a young person, and she kind of carried this through. She even talked about it a bit. I don't want to say bratty because it maybe diminishes it, but rebellious and had that kind of character. And she was interested in art from an early age, and she convinced her guardian to allow her to go to San Francisco to study art. So she went when she turned 18, and she lived in San Francisco for a period of time. Got a fairly conventional art education, but San Francisco would have been the closest major city. Victoria, it really was, there was almost a very amateur art scene. There was not a lot of, it was from the point of view of the time, a kind of outpost of empire, really. And even though there were other things happening here, but so it was. She had to go elsewhere to have the kind of training that she needed, and she did that in San Francisco. She came back to Victoria, realized she hadn't really satisfied herself, and then ended up going to London and studied at the Westminster School of Art. This is around 1899. And so she was, kind of in the middle of the city, struggled with that in different ways, missed Canada a lot, but was also, very engaged with the training. Came back, became ill, and ended up coming back to Canada, and still wasn't quite finished trying to get her training, because she was starting to hear about the kind of modern movement that was, really had become dominant by that point. But was nowhere to be found in her local environment. And so she went to Paris and studied there as well. And so that's where she encountered, post-impressionism and early Fauvism and other things. And these really influenced her, opened up her palette and started her down a road. Came back to BC again, and then really struggled because there was just no market for what she was doing, and no real appreciation at first. And it took a significant amount of time before she finally connected with other modernist painters in Eastern Canada, which was much more developed, so in Toronto. And then she finally started to get support, but and her correspondence with other artists and other people then became extremely important. And that's when she kind of moved to this later phase of her paintings, where I think her style becomes what we see here, kind of her mature style, where she was really able to represent the forests in the way that I think again has just influenced art in this province hugely ever since.
And these are big journeys. I mean, I imagine she must have gone overland to the East Coast, and then caught a ship to Paris and to London. I mean, these are, she's obviously a determined young woman. I started at the beginning saying there's a very, there's a tiny connection in that I studied film and photography at what was called then the Polytechnic, the Westminster Polytechnic. And I did check whether the Westminster School of Art had anything to do with the Westminster Polytechnic. In fact, they were different. But the Westminster School of Art is was right next to Westminster Abbey. Quite an interesting building. I mean, this kind of four floors, I think, of galleries around a central courtyard, which was covered in a glass roof. Felt like a bit like a museum. But then, of course, it's interesting that she then heads to Paris and you mentioned the Fauves. I think it's worth, anyone listening, it's worth having a little read up about the Fauves. I guess Matisse is probably the most famous, but you can certainly see that in some of Emily Carr's other works. I mean, I think if you look at some of the paintings that she did in and around France, you can obviously tell see the influence. Just on the subject of galleries, I mean, the Vancouver Art Gallery, doesn't that open in 1931, so the same year as this painting? So
that's right. Art history is absolutely entwined with her career. And in fact, I think a big part of the rationale for our existing in the early years was to be a home for this collection of paintings.
Okay.
It wasn't an issue. I mean, in our very earliest moments, there was a lot of interest in bringing European painting here. So a lot of our kind of founders collection is actually Dutch landscapes and things like that that were meant to come here to teach people, civilize the population basically with exposure to that sort of art. But even at that, by the 30s, there were a lot of people who were saying, why are we doing this? There was it gets tied into these kind of early moments of Canadian nationalism as well. That we need to have our own art, that we, and also that art was going to be modern. And so that's the narrative that she gets taken up by and with herself.
So I was going to ask this question. I mean, we recently made a film about London's National Gallery, and essentially the film has 21 people telling us their favourite painting, the majority of whom are staff members. But it coincided with the 200th anniversary of the National Gallery. So I was researching, for example, why is it called the National Gallery? What did that mean? Now, part of that was to distinguish from the British Museum, so they didn't want to say the British Gallery. But the question is, what does national mean? Does that mean that you only have national artists? Does it mean that you try to reflect the history of world art for your national audience? Or, as is pretty much the case with the National Gallery, do you just try to accumulate great examples of Western European art to edify and educate and elevate your domestic audience? So my question is, the Vancouver Art Gallery, if people go to Vancouver and they go into the art gallery, are they going to be seeing, as you say, examples of international art, or is there much more a sense of, no, this is a home for, and I know it's the biggest museum and gallery in Western Canada, but is this the home of Western Canadian art and artists?
I think probably people have given different answers to that question at different times. We're absolutely, I think, clearly a museum for British Columbia, for this province. And that's a really important part of our collection. And I'd say it dominates our collection right now as it is. We also definitely have an ambition to cover Canadian art. And so we have that, but we do collect international work as well. I think our audience needs to have an opportunity to see that work as well. So the way we've talked about it recently is thinking about it, each one of those is a kind of a third. I'm not a very mathematical person, so I'll throw out a number, but each of those is a kind of a third of the collecting mandate that we have to, and we try to bring all those things together. We have strengths. One of our challenges, I think, is because we in the history of museums, which is not super long in the grand scheme of things, but we come in very late in the 1930s, and the representation of our province in art, other than Indigenous art, which is another giant issue of representation here. We don't have a lot of the early images of the province. A lot of those were done by people who traveled through and then went back to wherever they came from, and they didn't, they haven't been deposited here necessarily. So that's our collection tends to be very modern and contemporary, I'd say. It leans in that direction for sure.
Now, I'm no expert on Canadian art, but I have heard of the Group of Seven. People, when I do screenings in Canada, often say, will you make a film about the Group of Seven? In fact, I saw a very good film that was made that left me feeling that I didn't need to repeat what was already a good film. But going back to Emily Carr, as I understand it, correct me if I'm wrong, but she's not one of the group of seven, but she was, affiliated to, associated with, welcomed by the group of seven. So perhaps just very briefly, what is the group of seven, and what's Emily Carr's relationship to them?
The group were a group of Toronto-based painters who came together around their shared interests in modernism, and who had, a project that was really doing what I mentioned before in terms of kind of setting out a national landscape, representing the country, and really creating a powerful idea. It was powerful when they were working, and it became very powerful again around in the 1960s when Canada had another moment of intense national reflection around the centenary of Confederation, but more just the kind of coming into its own, so that work has been iconic in Canada, especially a group of seven, especially in Ontario, and Emily Carr especially here. And when Carr finally connected with those artists, they recognized the quality of the work that she was doing, and she suddenly recognized that there were a bunch of artists who were on a very similar track to her, and so it was very inspirational for her, I think. And because there were moments when she had stopped painting altogether, she was having all sorts of financial difficulties. She ran a boarding house for a fairly long period of time. And so when she started to finally get that recognition, I think it was a huge moment.
Well, Richard, it's been absolutely fascinating talking about her. I thoroughly encourage people not only to look at this painting very carefully, but to look at her broader oeuvre. I'll certainly be coming back to the gallery next time I'm in Vancouver. And I look forward to future exhibitions that include her or focus on her. Absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much. Just to say, to anyone listening to the Painting of the Week podcast, if you have enjoyed listening, there are another 65 or 66 available on the 7th-art.com website. Please do tell your friends, of course, and let's get as many people talking and listening and looking at art as we possibly can. Richard, thank you again. Thank you to the Vancouver Art Gallery. Anyone that goes to Vancouver, I 100% recommend you go and visit. One final question. I remember reading somewhere of the right now, the Vancouver Art Gallery is right in the heart of the city. But I remember reading somewhere that there was the possibility it might be moving to have more space, because you've got, 12,000 artworks, and no gallery can ever exhibit all that it owns. But is there a move to move?
There is a move to move, and we're working on designs for a new building in a new location. We're in an old renovated courthouse right now. It's a lovely building, but it's it was never purpose built for what we do. So we're very excited about that. We're also really we're very ambitious for Emily. We really want to get her out to the wider world. So I think we're working on a larger exhibition that we're hoping to tour. And I think the world is kind of we've opened up to each other in ways, maybe thanks to the internet in some sense, where I think Canadian artists have really struggled to get recognition outside of Canada. Even artists who I think are genuinely like Emily Carr, could take their place alongside other major modernist artists of her generation, and I think people are kind of. I'm hoping we're kind of getting to a moment. Maybe this podcast is an incident of that, where people are kind of looking beyond their local or even maybe kind of the international centers to try to understand what's been overlooked. So I'm hoping that this is going to be a good moment for more people to be able to really appreciate her work.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much for the opportunity to talk about her.
No, absolutely. And of course, you've got a fairly major soccer tournament coming your way, so that'll be bringing visitors, no doubt. Richard, thank you again. And I do thoroughly recommend people take a closer look at Emily Carr. Thank you. See you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Painting of the Week podcast. For more information, please visit our website at seventh-art.com or contact us by emailing info@seventh-art.com. See you next time.